His retired war dog wouldn't stop barking at the floor. Then the Navy SEAL discovered who was buried below it. Homeless at 46, former Navy SEAL Garrett Boone thought the abandoned ice shed on Blackwater Lake would be nothing more than shelter from another brutal Montana winter. But on the first night inside, his retired military K9, Mako, began barking at the warped wooden floor like something alive was trapped underneath. By sunrise, strange footprints circled the property, and Garrett realized somebody would kill to keep the frozen secret buried. Comment 1 if you trust a dog's instincts more than people, or 0 if you think Garrett should have walked away, and tell us where you're watching from. The snow had started before dawn and never really stopped. By mid-afternoon, the little mountain town of Elk Hollow looked buried inside a world made entirely of white and gray. Snow clung to the roofs of the feed store and the old church on Main Street. It drifted knee-deep against parked trucks and gathered in thick, frozen ridges along the sidewalks. The mountains beyond town were almost invisible behind the storm, only dark shadows beneath the heavy sky. Garrett Boone sat behind the wheel of his pickup truck, with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of stale gas station coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The heater in the truck barely worked anymore. Cold air slipped through cracks in the door seals and moved across the cab in thin, icy streams. The old Ford rattled softly every time the wind pushed against it. A sleeping bag lay crumpled in the back seat beside a duffel bag and a stack of unopened bills Garrett no longer bothered reading. In the passenger seat sat Mako. The German shepherd's gray muzzle rested near the window, his amber eyes calmly tracking the movement of people outside. Even at 11 years old, the retired military dog carried himself with the quiet alertness of a soldier still standing watch. Garrett reached over and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You hungry, buddy?" Mako's tail thumped once against the seat. "That makes 2 of us." Garrett stared through the windshield at the county courthouse annex across the street. The old brick building looked tired and forgotten, like everything else in Elk Hollow. A crooked sign near the entrance read, "County Tax Lien Auction. Today." He checked the folded bills in his coat pocket again, even though he already knew the exact amount. $20. That was everything he had left in the world after diesel fuel and dog food. 46 years old. Former Navy SEAL. Decorated twice. Homeless. The words still didn't sound real when they crossed his mind. A gust of wind rocked the truck harder this time. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. For a second he heard something else entirely. Rotor blades. Gunfire cracking across stone alleys. A man screaming for a medic. His chest tightened instantly. Not here. Not now. Not. He opened his eyes and forced himself back into the cold Montana afternoon. Mako lifted his head immediately, sensing the shift in him before Garrett spoke a word. The dog leaned against his arm with quiet pressure, grounding him. Garrett swallowed hard and exhaled slowly. "I'm good," he whispered. But he wasn't. He hadn't been good for years. Not since Afghanistan. Not since the mission outside Kandahar, where 2 men under his command never came home. The doctors called it PTSD. Garrett called it living with ghosts. He stepped out into the snow and pulled his coat tighter against the wind. His knees ached from the cold as he crossed the street beside Mako. The dog stayed close to his left leg automatically, trained instincts surviving long after war. Inside, the courthouse annex smelled like wet wool, burnt coffee, and old paper. About 20 people sat scattered across folding chairs while a county clerk shuffled folders near the front podium. Most of the crowd looked local. Ranchers, mechanics, retired couples looking for cheap land or old equipment. Conversations drifted softly through the room until Garrett entered with Mako. Then the room quieted just a little. Not because of Garrett, because of the dog. People always noticed Mako. The shepherd's thick black and gray coat, scarred muzzle, and calm military posture made him impossible to ignore. He moved through the room without barking or pulling, his eyes constantly scanning exits and corners with old, disciplined habit. Garrett found a seat near the back wall. A rancher in a brown canvas coat sat beside him, chewing tobacco slowly. He looked to be around 70, weathered by hard winters and outdoor work. The old man glanced at Garrett. "You local?" Garrett shook his head. "Passing through." The rancher nodded once. "Storm will trap you here tonight?" "Wouldn't be the first place." The old man studied Mako quietly. "Military dog?" "Retired." "He looks smarter than most people in this county." Garrett almost smiled at that. Almost. The auction began. Old farm equipment, a rusted snowmobile, a foreclosure cabin with broken plumbing, most of it sold cheap. Garrett barely listened. He wasn't there to buy anything. Hell, $20 wouldn't buy much anyway. Mostly he just needed somewhere warm to sit for an hour. The county clerk adjusted her glasses and lifted another folder. "Next property," she announced. "Blackwater Lake Parcel 71, commonly known as the Mercer Ice House." The room changed instantly, not loudly, quietly, which somehow felt worse. People shifted in their seats. A woman near the front crossed herself. The rancher beside Garrett stopped chewing. Even Mako lifted his head. Garrett noticed all of it. The clerk cleared her throat awkwardly. "Property includes one abandoned ice storage shed and adjacent easement rights. Structure condemned for residential occupancy. Access road partially washed out. Minimum opening bid, $20. Silence. Nobody moved. The wind outside rattled the old courthouse windows. Garrett frowned slightly. An abandoned shed beside a lake. Not much. But 4 walls were still 4 walls. And condemned or not, it beat sleeping behind gas stations. The clerk looked around the room again. "No bids?" Garrett slowly raised his hand. "I got 20. Every eye in the room turned toward him. The rancher beside him muttered something under his breath. The clerk blinked twice. "Bid recognized. $20. Still nobody answered. The silence deepened. Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "You folks planning to bury a body out there or something?" A nervous laugh moved through the room but disappeared quickly. The clerk swallowed. "Any additional bids?" "Nothing." "Going once." The old rancher beside Garrett finally leaned closer. His voice dropped low. "Son, some places stay sealed for a reason." Garrett looked at him. What's that supposed to mean? But the old man only stared ahead. "Sold," the clerk announced sharply. $20 to Mr. Boone, Garrett answered. "Garrett Boone." The paperwork took 10 minutes. The county clerk avoided eye contact while handing him the deed and a rusted brass key attached to a cracked leather tag labeled Mercer. Outside, the storm had grown worse. Snow blew sideways across Main Street. Garrett climbed back into the truck and stared at the folded deed in his hands. Blackwater Lake. Mercer Ice House. Property value. Practically nothing. Yet nobody in town would touch it. Mako gave a low, quiet whine beside him. Garrett rubbed his face tiredly. "Well, partner," he murmured, starting the engine. "Looks like we own a shed." The drive to Blackwater Lake took nearly 40 minutes through winding mountain roads buried beneath fresh snow. The farther Garrett drove from town, the quieter the world became. Tall pines crowded both sides of the road. Snow hung heavy from their branches like thick white blankets. The mountains rose dark and enormous beyond the trees, disappearing into clouds. By the time Garrett finally spotted the lake, dusk was already settling across the valley. Blackwater Lake stretched wide and steel gray beneath the storm, frozen near the shore, dark open water farther out. The Mercer Ice House stood alone near the western bank. Garrett slowed the truck. The building looked older than he expected. Long and low beneath a sagging roof, weathered cedar walls blackened by decades of storms. The entire structure leaned slightly toward the frozen shoreline, as if the mountain itself had been slowly pulling it down. A faded wooden sign still hung crooked near the entrance. Mercer Ice Company. The paint had nearly vanished. Garrett parked beside the shed and killed the engine. Silence settled immediately. No traffic. No voices. Only wind moving across the frozen lake. For a moment, Garrett simply sat there, staring at the building. Something about the place felt strange. Not dangerous, exactly. Just abandoned in a way that didn't feel natural. Mako began growling softly. Garrett looked at him. The dog's ears stood rigid, his eyes locked onto the shed. "It's all right," Garrett said quietly. "Easy." But Mako didn't relax. Garrett stepped out first, boots crunching through deep snow. The cold hit him instantly, sharp enough to burn his lungs. The brass key groaned inside the old padlock. The doors opened slowly with a long wooden creak. Inside smelled like cedar, dust, old sawdust, and something colder beneath it all. The beam of Garrett's flashlight swept across the interior. Old tools still hung from the walls. Massive iron ice tongs, wooden sled runners, rust-covered saw blades longer than his arm. A heavy workbench stood near the far wall, beneath cracked windows coated in frost. The building looked frozen in time, as though somebody had simply walked out one day and never returned. Garrett stepped inside carefully. "Mako." The dog wouldn't move. He stood outside the doorway, growling deep in his throat now. Garrett frowned. "What's wrong with you?" Mako suddenly barked once. Sharp, violent, his gaze fixed downward, at the floor. Garrett swept the flashlight lower. The wooden planks near the center of the shed looked warped and uneven compared to the rest. Old water damage, maybe. Nothing more. But Mako's growling intensified. Then the shepherd backed away from the doorway entirely. That stopped Garrett cold. Mako had faced gunfire without retreating, explosions, ambushes, dark tunnels overseas, but now the dog refused to enter an empty shed. The wind outside moaned across the frozen lake. Garrett slowly looked back down at the warped floorboards, and somewhere deep beneath the old wood, he thought he heard the faintest sound. A dull, hollow knock, as if empty space waited underneath. Mako barked again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the abandoned ice house while darkness settled over Blackwater Lake. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, Garrett Boone felt the unmistakable sensation that something inside this forgotten place had been waiting for him. The wind outside rose sharply, rattling the loose cedar shakes overhead. Snow hissed across the frozen shoreline in long white sheets. Garrett stood motionless near the doorway, flashlight beam fixed on the warped section of floorboards, while Mako barked again from outside. Not frightened. Warning him. Garrett had heard that tone before. Afghanistan. 3 a.m. A dirt road outside Kandahar, where Mako froze beside a culvert seconds before an explosion ripped apart the vehicle behind them. The dog never barked without reason. Garrett slowly crouched beside the uneven planks and pressed his gloved hand against the wood. Cold. Colder than the rest of the floor. He knocked once with his knuckles. Thunk. Hollow underneath. His jaw tightened slightly. "Well," he muttered quietly. "That's comforting." Mako refused to cross the threshold. The shepherd paced back and forth in the snow, ears rigid, eyes locked on the center of the shed. Garrett stood again and swept the flashlight around the interior. Old iron hooks hung from rafters blackened by time. Thick ropes coiled along one wall. A wooden pulley system disappeared upward into darkness near the ceiling beams. The entire building smelled like cedar dust, frozen earth, and lake water trapped inside old wood. But beneath it all lingered another smell. Metal. Old metal. Not rust exactly. Something deeper. Garrett finally backed toward the doorway. "All right," he said softly to Mako. "We're not sleeping inside tonight." The dog relaxed immediately. That alone unsettled Garrett more than anything else. He closed the shed doors and secured the rusted padlock again before returning to the truck. Snow already covered most of his boot tracks. Inside the cab, Mako climbed into the back seat and settled down without taking his eyes off the shed. Garrett started the engine long enough to push weak heat through the vents, then shut it off to conserve fuel. Darkness swallowed the lake quickly. Out beyond the windshield, the Mercer ice house stood alone against the storm like a black shape frozen in another century. Garrett pulled the sleeping bag over himself and leaned back against the seat. But sleep didn't come easy. It never did anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, fragments returned, dust swirling through broken walls, radio chatter, the sharp crack of sniper fire across stone streets. He opened his eyes again immediately. Mako was awake too. The shepherd's ears twitched toward the shed. Listening. Garrett rubbed his face tiredly. "You hear something, buddy?" Mako gave a soft, low growl. Garrett looked toward the building again. For a brief second, he thought he saw movement near the side wall, a shadow slipping past the windows. His hand instinctively moved beneath the seat, where he kept the old 9mm pistol wrapped in cloth. Then the shadow vanished, probably blowing snow. Probably. Still, Garrett stayed awake most of the night watching the shed while the storm buried Blackwater Lake beneath another 6 inches of snow. By morning, the sky had cleared into a pale silver winter dawn. The mountains surrounding the lake rose enormous and sharp beneath fresh snow. Pine forests stretched dark along the slopes, while thin fog drifted low across the frozen shoreline. Garrett stepped out into air cold enough to sting his teeth. Mako immediately trotted toward the shed. Again, the dog stopped at the doorway. Again, he growled. Garrett unlocked the doors slowly. Morning light spilled across the warped floorboards inside. Nothing had changed. No footprints. No movement. Only silence. Yet Mako still refused to enter. Garrett spent the next hour cleaning snow away from the entrance and inspecting the property. Behind the shed, he found the remains of an old dock buried beneath ice and driftwood. Rusted machinery sat half-collapsed beneath tarps stiff with frost. An old iron sign near the lakeshore read, "Mercer Ice Company, established. 1948, the lettering had faded almost white. Garrett studied the frozen lake stretching toward distant mountains. Hard place to build a business. Hard place to survive winter. Which probably explained why he felt strangely comfortable there. Military life had taught him something important years ago. Some men are built for warm houses and crowded rooms. Others are built for lonely places. Near noon, he drove back into Elk Hollow for supplies. The town looked brighter under clear skies, though the cold remained brutal. Smoke curled from chimneys along Main Street, while snowplows pushed through fresh drifts near the hardware store. Garrett bought canned soup, coffee, batteries, and a sack of dog food with money scavenged from the truck console. That left him less than $8. At the register, the cashier noticed the brass Mercer key hanging from Garrett's coat. Her expression shifted immediately. "You bought that place?" Garrett nodded. "The ice shed." The woman hesitated. "My uncle used to talk about it when I was little." "Good things?" She didn't answer directly. People stopped going near Blackwater after old Nathaniel disappeared. Garrett looked up. "Nathaniel Mercer?" The cashier nodded while bagging the supplies. "My grandfather said the whole lake changed after that winter." "What happened to him?" "No one knows." Garrett waited, but she simply handed him the bag. Outside, Mako sat alert in the truck watching the street. Garrett scratched the dog's neck once before climbing in. "You're getting us popular already." The shepherd leaned against him briefly. For a moment, Garrett allowed himself to enjoy the simple warmth of another living creature beside him. It had been a long time since he'd belonged anywhere. On the edge of town, he noticed a small diner tucked beside the gas station. Mabel's Diner. The smell of bacon and coffee hit him the moment he stepped inside. Warmth rolled through the room like a physical thing. The diner looked untouched since the 1970s. Red vinyl booths lined the windows. A jukebox glowed softly near the back wall. Ranchers and mechanics sat drinking coffee beneath mounted elk antlers and faded photographs of old Elk Hollow winters. Conversations lowered slightly when Garrett entered with Mako. An elderly waitress approached carrying a pot of coffee. "We don't usually allow dogs." Mako's service trained. The woman looked down at the shepherd. Mako sat calmly beside Garrett's leg without moving. After a moment, she nodded. "He behaves better than most men in here anyway." Garrett almost smiled again. Almost. He took a booth near the window while Mako settled beside him. The waitress poured coffee. "You're the fellow bought Mercer's place yesterday." News traveled fast in small towns. "Guess so." "You know anything about ice harvesting?" "Not much." The waitress leaned one elbow against the booth. "My father hauled lake ice out there 50 years ago. Whole valley depended on it before refrigeration got common." Garrett listened quietly. She pointed toward the mountains beyond town. "They cut blocks from Blackwater every January. Crystal clear ice stacked underground in sawdust cellars. Lasted nearly year-round." "Sounds like hard work." It was. Something softened in her expression. But folks around here respected hard work back then. Before Garrett could answer, another voice spoke nearby. "You sleeping there already?" Garrett looked up. An elderly woman stood near the counter wrapped in a dark wool coat. White hair braided neatly behind her head. Pale blue eyes sharp as winter glass. The waitress nodded toward her. "That's Evelyn Mercer." Garrett straightened slightly. "The Mercer?" She approached slowly and extended one gloved hand. "My father built the ice house." Garrett shook it. "Garrett Boone." Her eyes moved toward Mako immediately. "That dog served overseas." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "I can tell." She slid into the booth across from him uninvited. Outside, snow drifted softly through pale sunlight, while the diner hummed quietly around them. "My father trusted military dogs more than most people," Evelyn said. Garrett frowned slightly. "He was military?" "Army engineers. Vietnam." Something in the way she said it made Garrett pay closer attention. Evelyn wrapped both hands around a coffee cup the waitress placed before her. "The Mercer Ice House used to feed half this valley," she said quietly. "Winter harvests started before sunrise. Men worked lanterns across the lake while horses hauled blocks through snow deep as fence posts." As she spoke, Garrett could almost see it. Dark winter mornings, saw blades cutting through frozen water, steam rising from horses in moonlight, the kind of hard, disciplined labor that demanded silence and endurance. It reminded him strangely of military life. Routine, precision, trust. Evelyn smiled faintly at the memory. "My father used to say winter was something you harvested if you respected it enough." Garrett glanced toward the snowy mountains outside. "Why'd it stop?" The old woman's expression faded. "Because some things disappear when people stop listening to places." Not an answer. Not fully. Before Garrett could ask more, Mako suddenly lifted his head sharply. The shepherd stared toward the diner window. Low growl. Garrett turned instinctively. Across the street, a black SUV sat parked beside the hardware store. Engine running. Dark-tinted windows. Watching. Then the vehicle slowly pulled away through drifting snow. Garrett felt the familiar tightening in his chest again. The old instincts returning. Mako continued staring long after the SUV disappeared. Evelyn noticed. "So," she said softly, "the dog hears it too." Garrett looked back at her. "Hears what?" But the old woman only lifted her coffee and stared out toward the mountains surrounding Blackwater Lake, as though remembering something she wished she could forget. And somewhere far beyond town, hidden beneath snow and cedar and frozen earth, the old Mercer ice house waited quietly beside the lake, watching. By the time Garrett Boone drove back to Blackwater Lake, dusk had already begun slipping down the mountains. The sky above Elk Hollow faded from pale gray into deep winter blue, and the temperature dropped hard enough to freeze the moisture along the inside of the truck windows. Snow squealed beneath the tires as Garrett followed the narrow lake road through dark pine forest. Mako sat upright in the passenger seat the entire drive, alert, silent, watching the trees. Garrett noticed it without saying anything. The dog had not relaxed once since they first arrived at the Mercer property. Not once. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Military dogs lived by instinct. Years of combat training sharpened them into creatures that reacted to danger before humans even understood it existed. Garrett had trusted Mako's instincts overseas more times than he could count. The shepherd had detected buried explosives, hidden fighters, collapsed structures ready to fall. Once in Helmand Province, Mako refused to enter a building moments before the roof gave way under artillery damage. Dogs did not fear ghosts, which meant something else was wrong. The headlights finally swept across the frozen shoreline of Blackwater Lake. The Mercer ice house emerged slowly through drifting snow, dark and lonely against the edge of the forest. Weak moonlight reflected across the ice beyond it in long silver streaks. Garrett parked beside the shed and killed the engine. The silence hit immediately. No wind now, no movement. Only the faint cracking sounds of lake ice shifting somewhere out in the darkness. Garrett grabbed the flashlight from the dashboard. "Let's go." But Mako didn't move. The shepherd remained rigid in the passenger seat, staring toward the shed. Garrett opened the door. "Mako?" Still nothing. Then the dog gave a low, warning growl deep in his chest. Garrett followed the direction of his gaze. The shed doors. One of them stood slightly open. Garrett felt his pulse slow instantly. Not fear. Training. The calm that came before danger. He knew for certain he had locked those doors earlier. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots as he approached. No fresh wind had come through. No reason for the latch to fail. Mako finally jumped from the truck and stayed close against Garrett's left leg. The old instincts returned naturally now. Scan the surroundings. Check the tree line. Watch for movement. Listen. Garrett drew the pistol from beneath his coat and clicked off the safety. The flashlight beam cut through darkness as he pushed the door wider. The smell inside hit him first. Cold cedar, dust, and fresh air. Someone had been inside. Mako moved ahead of him now, shoulders low, nose working carefully. Garrett swept the flashlight across the room. Nothing looked disturbed. The old tools still hung where they had before. Frost coated the windows. Snow drifted faintly across the threshold. Then Mako stopped suddenly. The dog turned sharply toward the center of the shed and barked once. The warped floorboards. Again. Garrett approached slowly. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, though he told himself it was only from the cold. He crouched beside the boards and inspected them more carefully this time. Old wood. Water damage. But something else, too. Tiny scratches near the seams. Recent scratches, as though somebody had tried prying the boards up. Garrett touched the marks silently. Mako growled harder now. His eyes remained locked downward. Garrett knocked against the floor again. Thunk, Hollow. Definitely hollow. His jaw tightened. Somebody's been down there. The words sounded too loud inside the empty shed. Mako suddenly snapped his head toward the rear wall. A sound. Soft. Outside. Garrett killed the flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed the room. He listened carefully. Crunch. Snow. Slow footsteps somewhere beyond the shed. Mako's growl deepened. Garrett moved quietly toward the side window and lowered himself beneath it. Another crunch. Closer now. Whoever stood outside was moving carefully, watching the building. Garrett steadied his breathing automatically. The old military instincts flooded back with uncomfortable ease. Every nerve sharpened. Every sound separated itself clearly from the silence around it. A branch creaked outside. Then a shadow moved briefly past the frosted glass. Garrett rose fast and shoved open the side door. "Hey!" The figure bolted instantly toward the trees. Dark coat, heavy boots, male. Garrett sprinted after him through knee-deep snow while Mako exploded forward beside him. The man disappeared between the pines near the lakeshore. Garrett caught only fragments in the moonlight. A black knit cap, broad shoulders, fast. Too fast for a local drunk wandering near the property. "Mako!" The shepherd surged ahead like a gray missile through the snow. Branches snapped in darkness. Then came a sharp shout somewhere in the trees. Human. Startled. Garrett pushed harder through the drifts, lungs burning in the brutal cold. By the time he reached the forest edge, the figure had vanished. Only silence remained between the snow-covered trunks. Mako stood several yards ahead, growling toward darkness. Garrett scanned the woods carefully. Nothing. No movement, no voices. Just moonlight filtering through frozen branches. Finally, he exhaled slowly. Back. Mako obeyed immediately, though the fur along his shoulders remained raised. Garrett noticed something half-buried near the snowbank as they returned toward the shed. A cigarette. Still warm. He stared at it quietly. Somebody had absolutely been watching the property. And not for the first time. Back inside the shed, Garrett secured the doors carefully before lighting an old kerosene lantern he found hanging near the workbench. Warm yellow light flickered across the cedar walls, making the place feel even older somehow. Mako resumed pacing near the warped floor. Round and round, never settling. Garrett sat on an overturned crate and studied the dog. "You want to tell me what's down there?" Mako stopped. The shepherd stared directly at him, then slowly placed one paw against the floorboards. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Garrett rubbed his tired eyes. Outside, snow began falling again in soft, drifting sheets. He hadn't slept properly in 3 nights, maybe 4. Time blurred lately, especially during winter. The lantern hissed softly beside him, and without warning, exhaustion dragged him backward into memory. Afghanistan. Night operation. Rain. Garrett moved silently through a narrow alley while radio chatter crackled in his earpiece. Mako worked ahead beside another SEAL operator named Chris Mercer, a kid from Idaho barely 24 years old who never stopped talking about buying land after deployment. Then Mako froze, completely rigid. Garrett remembered shouting, remembered turning. Then the explosion, fire swallowing the alley, concrete, blood, the scream afterward. Garrett jerked awake violently, breathing hard. The lantern still burned beside him. The shed remained silent except for the storm outside. But Mako stood directly in front of him now, watching him carefully. Garrett wiped sweat from his forehead despite the freezing air. Damn it! The panic attack came fast after that. Like always, his chest tightened until breathing hurt. The room suddenly felt too small, too dark. Every sound sharpened painfully, metal creaking overhead, wind outside. the ticking hiss of the lantern. Garrett stood abruptly and stumbled outside into the freezing night air. Snow hit his face immediately. Good. Cold helped sometimes. He leaned against the truck, breathing hard, while Blackwater Lake stretched silently before him beneath moonlight. Mako followed a moment later and pressed against his side. Solid. Warm. Real. Garrett closed his eyes and rested one hand against the dog's neck. The panic slowly loosened its grip. "You always know before I do," he whispered. Mako stayed pressed against him until Garrett's breathing steadied again. Far across the frozen lake came a strange, low, groaning sound. The shifting ice. Deep. Ancient. Garrett stared across the darkness. The Mercer ice house loomed behind them beneath falling snow. Waiting. Watching. And somewhere beneath its warped floorboards, hidden under decades of cedar and frozen earth, something hollow waited in silence. Something another man had tried very hard to hide. Something other men were now willing to watch from the shadows. Garrett looked down at Mako. The old shepherd was still staring toward the center of the shed. Still listening. Still refusing to sleep. And deep inside himself, Garrett realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he no longer felt numb. He felt alert. Alive. Which meant whatever waited beneath the Mercer ice house had already started pulling him in, whether he wanted it to or not. Morning came slow over Blackwater Lake. Gray light spread across the frozen shoreline while snow drifted softly through the pine trees. The mountains surrounding the valley looked enormous beneath fresh powder, silent and cold beneath a pale winter sky. Garrett Boone stood outside the shed, holding a steaming cup of black coffee between both hands. Mako sat beside him near the truck, watching the tree line. Always watching now. The shepherd had barely slept. Neither had Garrett. The strange footsteps in the snow, the open shed door, the shadow moving through the forest, none of it felt random anymore. Somebody had been there. Somebody had known about the building long before Garrett arrived. And still the warped floorboards haunted him most. He could feel them sitting inside the shed behind him, like a thought he couldn't shake loose. The hollow sound underneath. The cold air rising through the seams. The feeling of being watched. Garrett swallowed the last bitter mouthful of coffee and forced himself to focus on practical things instead. The roof sagged badly along the western side of the shed. Snow weight would eventually collapse it if he didn't reinforce the beams soon. The windows needed sealing. One wall leaned inward nearly 3 inches. A condemned ice house wasn't much, but it was still more than he'd had 2 weeks ago. He grabbed an old pry bar from the workbench and climbed onto the roof carefully while Mako patrolled below. The cold air burned his lungs immediately. From up there, Garrett could see almost the entire lake. Blackwater stretched wide through the valley like dark steel beneath drifting snow. Forest wrapped around its edges, while steep mountains rose beyond it in layers of white and gray. Beautiful country. Lonely country. The kind of place a man disappeared into. As Garrett worked loose a cracked cedar plank, the rhythmic scrape of metal against wood slowly settled his nerves. Simple work. Clear purpose. That helped. Military life had trained him to survive chaos by focusing on the next task directly in front of him. Repair this. Carry that. Clear the room. Watch the ridge. One step at a time. That was how men stayed sane. Or tried to. Below him, Mako suddenly barked sharply. Garrett froze. The dog stood near the edge of the property staring toward the lake road. A truck approached slowly through drifting snow. Old green Ford pickup. Rust along the wheel wells. The driver stepped out carefully after parking near the shed. An older man. 70 maybe. Heavy canvas coat and a brown fur hat pulled low against the cold. Garrett climbed down from the roof, as the stranger approached. "Morning," the old man called. Garrett nodded cautiously. The man's eyes moved immediately to Mako. "Well now," he muttered softly. "That explains why folks in town are nervous." Garrett rested the pre-bar against the wall. "You know me already?" "Small town." The old man extended one gloved hand. "Name's Walter Grinnell. Used to haul ice for Mercer back in the 70s. Garrett shook his hand carefully. "You worked here?" "Half my life." Walter turned slowly toward the lake. "There used to be 40 men on this shoreline every winter. Horses, lanterns, sleds moving across the ice before dawn." He smiled faintly. "Could hear saw blades singing across the lake from 2 miles away." Garrett glanced toward the frozen water. Hard to imagine now. The old man noticed the tools scattered around the shed. "You fixing her up?" "Trying." Walter nodded approvingly. "Good." His expression changed slightly after that. More serious. "You find anything strange in there yet?" Garrett looked at him closely. "What kind of strange?" Walter hesitated, then shrugged. "Nathaniel Mercer got odd during the last years. Always talking about noises under the ice. Trucks coming at night. Men watching the property." Garrett's pulse tightened slightly. "You believe him?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Mako. The shepherd stood motionless beside the shed doors, staring directly at the warped floor inside. Walter noticed that too. "He won't go near it?" "No. That dog's smarter than most people around here." The exact same thing the rancher at the courthouse had said. Garrett frowned. "You all keep talking like this place is cursed." Walter gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "No, son. Not cursed." His eyes drifted toward the lake again. "Just buried." Before Garrett could ask what that meant, Walter climbed back into his truck. As the engine started, the old man leaned out the window one final time. "You ever hear lake ice crack at night?" "Sure." Walter nodded slowly. "Some sounds come from the cold." He looked toward the shed. "And some don't." Then he drove away. The silence afterward felt heavier somehow. Garrett watched the truck disappear down the snowy road, while Mako remained fixed beside the shed entrance. The dog still had not entered willingly. Not once. That afternoon, Garrett drove into Elk Hollow for lumber and roof tar. The hardware store smelled like cedar shavings and motor oil. Country music played softly through old speakers while snow boots squeaked across worn wooden floors. Garrett loaded supplies onto the counter while the owner rang them up. "Mercer Place keeping you busy?" the man asked casually. Garrett nodded. "Roof's about ready to collapse. That old building's lasted longer than most marriages in this town." Garrett almost smiled again. Almost. Then something metallic crashed loudly in the back room. The sound hit Garrett like a rifle shot. Instantly, his body locked tight. Breathing stopped. His vision narrowed hard around the edges. Afghanistan slammed back into him without warning. Concrete walls, dust, screaming over the radio, a teammate yelling his name. Garrett staggered backward into a shelf before he even realized where he was. The store owner's voice sounded distant now. "You all right there?" Garrett couldn't answer. His chest clenched painfully. The room suddenly felt too crowded, too loud, too small. Mako moved instantly. The shepherd pressed hard against Garrett's legs, grounding him physically before panic swallowed him completely. "Easy," the owner said carefully now. "Take your time." Garrett forced himself to focus on the dog's fur beneath his fingers. Real, solid. Not Afghanistan. Not the alley. Not the explosion. Slowly, the panic loosened enough for him to breathe again. Embarrassment settled in immediately afterward. The worst part wasn't the fear anymore. It was knowing strangers had seen it happen. Garrett grabbed the supplies quickly. How much? Forget it. I said how much. The owner hesitated before naming a number. Garrett paid silently and headed for the door. Outside, cold mountain air hit him like water. He stood beside the truck, breathing hard, while snow drifted through late afternoon sunlight. Mako leaned quietly against his side. You always drag me back, Garrett whispered. The shepherd looked up at him calmly. Garrett rubbed one hand across his face. He hated the attacks, hated how helpless they made him feel. Years ago, he could clear buildings under gunfire without hesitation. Men trusted him with their lives. Now a slammed metal toolbox could break him apart inside a hardware store. War didn't always kill you clean. Sometimes it just hollowed you out slowly afterward. The drive back to Blackwater Lake felt longer that evening. Clouds gathered low over the mountains again, while fading sunlight turned the snowfields pale blue. Garrett kept remembering the look on the hardware owner's face. Pity. He hated pity almost more than fear. By the time he reached the Mercer property, darkness had started settling across the valley. The shed waited beside the frozen lake exactly where he'd left it. Silent. Still. Watching. Garrett unloaded lumber while Mako circled the building carefully. Then the dog froze near the rear wall, growling. Garrett immediately set down the boards. What is it? Mako moved toward the trees behind the shed, nose low to the snow. Garrett followed carefully. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the footprints, fresh, boot prints leading from the forest directly toward the back of the building. His heartbeat slowed instantly again. Military calm. The tracks circled the shed once before disappearing toward the lake. Garrett crouched beside them. Large boots, deep impressions. Recent, very recent. Mako growled harder. Garrett followed the tracks toward the shoreline until he stopped suddenly. Out on the frozen lake, nearly 200 yards from shore, sat a dark shape. A snowmobile. Parked, engine off, watching the property. Garrett narrowed his eyes. The rider wore black winter gear and a helmet that concealed the face completely. Neither man moved. Snow drifted silently between them across the frozen lake. Then the rider started the engine. The machine roared sharply through the stillness before racing across the ice toward the far side of Blackwater Lake, gone within seconds. Garrett stared after it silently. No accident now. No coincidence. Somebody was watching the Mercer ice house constantly, and whatever they feared beneath that floor was important enough to track a homeless veteran all the way into the mountains. Behind him, Mako barked sharply toward the shed again, toward the warped floorboards hidden inside. The dog's instincts had never been wrong before. And deep down, Garrett Boone already knew something terrible waited beneath that old ice house, something connected to Nathaniel Mercer, something powerful enough to make strangers watch from frozen lakes in the middle of winter. The snow began falling harder again as darkness swallowed Blackwater Lake, and for the first time in years, Garrett felt something stronger than grief. Purpose. The realization settled inside him quietly as snow fell across Blackwater Lake. Not hope, not peace, something harder. The same feeling he used to get before missions overseas when instinct told him a situation was bigger than it first appeared. The same calm alertness that arrived when danger stopped being random and became understandable. Somebody was watching the Mercer ice house. Somebody was afraid of what lay beneath it. And Mako had known from the beginning. That night, Garrett reinforced the shed doors with heavy lumber, scavenged from the collapsed dock. He nailed blankets across the cracked windows to block the cold, and moved his sleeping bag inside beside the old workbench. Mako still refused to go near the warped floorboards. The shepherd paced wide circles around the center of the room, before finally settling near the doorway, where he could watch both Garrett and the outside world at the same time. The lantern cast soft amber light across the cedar walls, while wind moaned through the mountains beyond the lake. Garrett sat cleaning his pistol carefully on the workbench. The familiar motions steadied him. Disassemble. Inspect. Clean. Reassemble. Simple tasks. Predictable tasks. The kind that kept your mind from drifting into places better left buried. But his thoughts kept circling back to Nathaniel Mercer. Vietnam veteran. Ice harvester. Disappeared 20 years ago. Garrett glanced toward the warped floor again. What were you hiding down there? Mako lifted his head immediately. The dog stared at the floorboards, then toward the windows. Listening. Always listening. Sometime after midnight, the lake began making noise again. Low, booming cracks rolled through the darkness beneath the ice like distant thunder. The old shed creaked softly with each sound. Garrett had almost fallen asleep when Mako suddenly stood rigid, growling. Garrett reached for the pistol instantly. The dog moved toward the north wall this time instead of the floor. Another sound. Faint. Outside. Garrett killed the lantern flame. Darkness swallowed the room completely. Only moonlight remained now, filtering pale blue through the frost-covered windows. He listened carefully. Nothing. Then, crunch. Snow. Slow footsteps. Garrett moved silently beside the wall while Mako remained perfectly still near the door. The footsteps circled the shed once, paused, then continued toward the rear of the building. Garrett slipped outside through the side entrance with the pistol drawn low against his leg. The cold hit like knives. Moonlight reflected off the frozen lake bright enough to see by. Snow drifted softly through the trees, while the mountains loomed black against the night sky. Garrett moved around the back corner of the shed. Nobody. Only wind moving across the shoreline, but fresh tracks crossed the snow again. Large boots, the same size as before. His pulse slowed into that dangerous military calm once more. Someone wanted him nervous or distracted. Mako suddenly barked from inside the shed. Sharp, urgent. Garrett sprinted back through the doorway. The dog stood over the warped floorboards, growling violently now. And for the first time, Garrett noticed something else. A faint draft. Cold air rising through the cracks in the wood. He crouched low beside the boards and held one hand near the seams. Definitely air movement. From underneath. His eyes narrowed. There really was empty space below the shed. The old stories about an underground ice cellar suddenly felt far more real. Garrett slept little after that. By sunrise, he had already made up his mind. He needed answers. The next morning, Elk Hollow looked buried deeper beneath winter than ever before. Smoke curled from chimneys along Main Street, while snowplows groaned through fresh drifts. Garrett parked outside Mabel's diner again with Mako beside him. Conversations quieted slightly when he entered. People were watching him differently now. Not just curiosity anymore. Concern. Maybe even pity. Mabel herself approached carrying coffee before he sat down. "You still alive out there?" "So far." She poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug. "Then you're doing better than some." Garrett looked up. "What happened to Nathaniel Mercer?" The waitress hesitated. Every sound inside the diner suddenly seemed farther away. Finally, she slid into the booth across from him. "You ever hear of Warren Voss?" Garrett nodded slowly. "The developer? Owns half the valley now. Timber contracts, mining leases, vacation properties." Her expression hardened slightly. "His daddy used to run the old Blackwater mining company." Garrett listened quietly. Mabel lowered her voice. "Back in the 90s, folks around here started getting sick. Livestock, too. Water tasted strange near the eastern streams." "And Mercer?" He started asking questions. Snow brushed softly against the diner windows while she spoke. Nathaniel used to spend nights out on the lake. Said he saw trucks moving through the mountains after dark, dumping things near the reservoirs. Garrett frowned. Toxic waste? Maybe. What happened to him? Mabel stared into her coffee for a long moment. Officially, they said he wandered onto thin ice during a storm. And unofficially, she looked directly at him now. Some folks think Nathaniel Mercer found something powerful men wanted buried. Before Garrett could respond, the diner door opened. Cold air swept through the room. Every conversation stopped instantly. A tall man entered wearing a charcoal wool coat and expensive leather gloves. Mid-50s, maybe. Silver hair, clean-shaven face, confident, the kind of confidence wealth built over decades. Behind him came two younger men in dark jackets. Mabel muttered quietly, "Speak of the devil." The man scanned the diner calmly before his eyes settled on Garrett, then on Mako. He approached the booth with a polished smile. "You must be Garrett Boone." Garrett didn't stand. "That depends who's asking." "Warren Voss." He extended one hand. Garrett ignored it. The smile remained but cooled slightly. "I hear you bought the Mercer property." "Looks that way." Voss glanced toward Mako. "Beautiful dog." Mako growled softly. The man noticed. "So," Voss continued calmly, "I'd like to make you an offer." Garrett leaned back slightly. "For a condemned shed?" "That land borders future development zones." Voss removed a business card from his coat pocket. "I'm prepared to offer $20,000 cash for the property immediately." The entire diner had gone silent now. Garrett stared at him. $20,000 for a building nobody else would touch. That alone told him everything he needed to know. "I just bought it. And now you can make quite a profit." Garrett slid the business card back across the table untouched. "Not interested." Something flickered briefly behind Voss's eyes, then disappeared. "You sure?" "Very." Silence stretched between them. Then Voss smiled again, thin this time. "Well," he said softly, "if you change your mind, I'd advise doing so quickly." He turned and walked out of the diner with the two younger men following behind him. The room remained quiet until the black SUV disappeared down Main Street. Then conversations slowly resumed. Garrett looked toward Mabel. "You were right." "Told you." "What's he really after?" The waitress shook her head slowly. "Whatever Nathaniel Mercer buried from the world." Garrett looked out the window toward the snowy mountains surrounding Elk Hollow. Somewhere beneath all that wilderness lay answers men were willing to pay for, or kill for. Back at Blackwater Lake later that afternoon, Garrett found Mako standing near the rear wall of the shed, barking furiously toward the frozen shoreline. Garrett followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed movement far across the lake. A figure standing near the tree line, watching the property through binoculars. The moment Garrett spotted him, the figure vanished back into the forest. Mako barked harder. Garrett's stomach tightened. The pressure around the Mercer ice house was increasing. Fast. That evening, snow clouds gathered once more over the mountains, while darkness swallowed Blackwater Lake. Inside the shed, Garrett sat beside the lantern studying the warped floorboards again. Mako lay nearby, eyes open, waiting. Garrett finally stood and grabbed the pry bar from the workbench. The old wood creaked softly beneath his boots as he approached the center of the room. The dog immediately rose beside him. "You were right," Garrett whispered. Mako pressed close against his leg. Garrett slid the edge of the pry bar into the narrow seam between the warped boards. And somewhere deep beneath the Mercer ice house, hidden under decades of cedar and frozen earth, something waited in silence for the sound of that floor finally breaking open. The old wood groaned softly. Dust drifted upward in the lantern light. Mako stood beside Garrett, muscles rigid, low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Garrett pressed harder. The pry bar slipped beneath the plank with a sharp crack. Then, bang! Something slammed violently against the outside wall of the shed. Garrett spun instantly, pistol already in his hand. Mako exploded into furious barking. Another impact rattled the cedar siding. Snow fell from the rafters overhead. Someone was outside. Garrett killed the lantern flame immediately. Darkness swallowed the room. Only pale moonlight leaked through the frost-covered windows now, while Mako barked toward the rear wall. Garrett moved low beside the workbench, breathing slow and controlled. The old instincts returned fully whenever danger arrived. Fear disappeared. Thought narrowed. Listen. Track movement. Stay alive. Outside, boots crunched through snow. Fast now. Running. A shadow crossed one of the windows. Then another. 2 people. Maybe 3. Garrett moved toward the side entrance while Mako snarled beside him like a wolf ready to tear something apart. The shed doors suddenly shook under a heavy impact. Wood splintered loudly. "Open it up!" a voice shouted from outside. Not local. Younger. Aggressive. Garrett stayed silent. Another slam hit the doors harder. Mako lunged forward, barking furiously. The men outside laughed. "You in there, soldier?" Garrett's pulse slowed even further. They knew who he was, which meant somebody had been watching him closely. Another voice spoke. "Boss said scare him first." Garrett's jaw tightened. Boss. Warren Voss. The realization settled cold inside him. A third impact cracked one of the wooden braces Garrett had installed earlier that day. Mako barked wildly. Garrett leaned close to the dog's ear. "Stay." Then he slipped silently through the side entrance into the storm. Snow blasted across the property sideways, now beneath powerful mountain winds. Visibility dropped hard beyond 30 feet. Perfect conditions for confusion. Perfect conditions for a fight. Garrett moved around the rear corner of the shed, while the men focused on the front doors. 3 figures stood near the entrance, bundled in black winter gear. One carried a crowbar. Another held a flashlight. The third man kicked the doors again. "Come on out!" Garrett stepped silently through drifting snow until he stood less than 15 feet behind them. "Wrong move." All 3 men spun instantly. The pistol in Garrett's hand froze them. For one long second, nobody moved. Wind roared across Blackwater Lake behind them. Snow swirled through pale moonlight. Then the man with the flashlight smiled. "You think this place belongs to you now?" Garrett kept the gun steady. "Depends who's asking." "Walk away, old man." The insult barely registered. Garrett studied them carefully instead. Not professionals. Too nervous. Too loud. Hired muscle. The tallest one nodded toward the shed. "You got no idea what's under there." Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly. "So there is something." The man realized his mistake immediately. Too late. Mako burst through the front doors like an avalanche. The shepherd hit the man with the crowbar full force, knocking him backward into the snow with a scream. The flashlight flew sideways into darkness. Everything exploded at once after that. The second man rushed Garrett. Garrett pivoted instinctively, driving one hard punch into the attacker's ribs before shoving him backward across the ice-covered ground. The third man swung a length of pipe wildly. Garrett ducked. Metal whistled inches above his head. Mako snarled violently nearby while the first man struggled beneath the dog's weight. Then Garrett heard it. A sharp yelp. Pain. His stomach dropped instantly. "Mako!" The dog stumbled backward suddenly. One of the men had pulled a hunting knife during the struggle. Dark blood spread across Mako's shoulder fur almost instantly. Something inside Garrett snapped hard. Not panic. Not rage exactly. Something colder. The same dangerous calm he used to feel overseas when teammates got hurt. He moved fast, One brutal shove sent the knife attacker crashing into the side of the shed. Garrett tore the weapon away and slammed the man into the snow hard enough to end the fight immediately. The remaining two backed away quickly now, fear finally replacing arrogance. "You tell Voss something from me," Garrett said quietly. Nobody answered. Mako stood beside him again, despite the blood running down his leg, still growling, still protecting him. The tallest attacker grabbed his injured partner. "This ain't over." Then the three men disappeared into the storm toward the lake road. Garrett almost followed. Old instincts screamed to pursue. Finish it. But Mako staggered slightly beside him. That mattered more. Inside the shed, Garrett relit the lantern with shaking hands. The warm light revealed blood soaking through the shepherd's thick gray fur near the shoulder. Not deep enough to kill him, but deep enough. Garrett knelt immediately beside the dog. "Easy, buddy." Mako breathed heavily, but never once took his eyes off the doors, still guarding. Garrett dug through his old military medic kit from the truck while wind hammered the shed outside. The smell of antiseptic filled the room. His hands moved automatically. Clean wound. Stop bleeding. Check depth. The motions came back as naturally as breathing. Years ago, he'd treated teammates exactly like this under far worse conditions. The memory hit hard while he worked. Afghanistan again. Chris Mercer bleeding beside a collapsed wall. Another operator screaming for air support. Garrett forced the memory away. Focus. Mako whined softly as Garrett stitched the wound closed under lantern light. "You're all right," Garrett whispered. "You're all right." The shepherd finally rested his head against Garrett's knee. Outside, snow buried the attacker's tracks quickly, but one thing remained behind. The crowbar, dropped near the doorway during the fight. Garrett picked it up carefully. Something had been tied around the handle, a folded piece of paper wrapped in plastic. His pulse tightened again. He unfolded it slowly. 3 words written in thick black marker. "Stop digging now." Garrett stared at the message silently. Then he looked toward the warped floorboards. Mako lifted his head again immediately. Growling. The dog had nearly been killed tonight. Not over land. Not over an abandoned shed. Over whatever waited beneath that floor. Garrett stood slowly and walked back toward the loose plank he'd started prying open before the attack. The gap remained barely visible in lantern light. Cold air drifted upward through the crack. Steady. Real. The entire shed suddenly felt different now. Smaller. Like something hidden below them was breathing quietly beneath the wood. Garrett crouched low again. This time he noticed faint metal beneath the boards. Not dirt. Not foundation. Steel. His heartbeat slowed. A hatch. There was definitely something under there. Mako barked once sharply. Then both of them heard it. An engine. Far away at first. Garrett killed the lantern again instantly. Headlights appeared briefly through the trees near the lake road. Another vehicle approaching. Slowly. Watching the shed from a distance. The same way predators watched wounded animals. Garrett tightened his grip on the pistol. Mako stood beside him despite the pain in his shoulder. 2 soldiers in the darkness, still standing watch. The headlights remained motionless beyond the trees for nearly a full minute. Then they disappeared into the storm. Gone. But not far. Garrett relit the lantern slowly afterward. His eyes drifted once more toward the warped floorboards, toward the steel hidden underneath, toward whatever secret Nathaniel Mercer had buried so carefully beneath the ice house decades earlier. And for the first time since the war ended, Garrett Boone understood something clearly. He wasn't running anymore. Now he was guarding something. The realization settled over Garrett Boone while snow battered the walls of the Mercer ice house. The lantern flame flickered softly beside him, throwing long shadows across the cedar walls, while Mako lay near the doorway, breathing slow but alert despite the stitched wound along his shoulder. Outside, the storm deepened. Wind rolled across Blackwater Lake in low, mournful gusts that shook the old building from end to end. Snow scraped against the roof like handfuls of sand thrown across wood. Garrett stared at the warped floorboards in silence. Steel underneath. A hatch. The hidden space below the shed was real, and now men were willing to threaten and bleed for it. Mako lifted his head again and gave a low warning growl toward the floor. Garrett grabbed the pry bar. "All right," he muttered quietly. "Let's see what Nathaniel Mercer buried down there." He knelt beside the loose plank and wedged the metal bar deeper into the seam. The old boards groaned. Rust flakes drifted upward through the cracks. Garrett pulled harder. Crack! One plank finally split loose enough to lift. A blast of freezing air rolled upward from below. Not ordinary cold. Cellar cold. Deep earth cold. The kind of cold untouched by sunlight. Mako immediately stood despite the pain in his shoulder. The shepherd barked sharply once. Garrett swept the lantern lower. Beneath the boards lay thick steel. A rectangular hatch nearly 6 feet long, hidden under decades of warped cedar flooring. Heavy rivets lined the edges. Rust covered most of the surface, but faint lettering remained visible beneath the corrosion. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Garrett's pulse slowed hard. Military. The hatch had once belonged to the Army. Near the center, barely visible beneath rust and scratches, were 2 carved initials. N.M. Nathaniel Mercer. Garrett touched the letters silently. The old Vietnam engineer had hidden something beneath his icehouse using military-grade steel and enough secrecy to keep it buried for 20 years. Mako growled deeper now. Garrett studied the hatch carefully. A thick locking wheel remained frozen along one side, welded partially shut by rust and time. This wasn't a storage door. This was something built to stay closed. Wind slammed against the shed outside. The old building creaked violently. Garrett stood and searched the workbench until he found an old hammer and a rusted oil can. The work took nearly 2 hours. Oil, pressure, metal screaming against metal. Each grinding sound echoed through the icehouse like distant artillery fire. Several times Garrett had to stop when the noise triggered flashes of memory. Explosions, collapsed walls, men screaming through dust. Each metallic shriek from the hatch clawed against old wounds inside his head. But every time the panic started building, Mako pressed close beside him. Steady, grounding him, pulling him back. "You always know," Garrett whispered once while rubbing the shepherd's neck. "Don't you?" Mako leaned against him silently. Near midnight, the locking wheel finally shifted. A horrible grinding groan rolled through the shed, then stopped. Garrett froze, listening. Nothing outside now except storm and wind. Nobody watching tonight. Or maybe they simply believed the storm would stop him. He wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the freezing air, and gripped the heavy steel handle with both hands. The hatch resisted at first, then slowly began lifting. Cold air burst upward immediately. The lantern flame flickered violently. A smell emerged from below. Frozen earth, old metal, ancient cedar, and something else. Still water. Garrett raised the hatch fully and rested it against the floor. Darkness waited underneath. Complete darkness. The lantern beam revealed narrow steel stairs descending deep below the shed into blackness. Mako barked sharply. Garrett stared downward. The temperature near the opening felt at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the building. Frost coated the steel walls beneath. The underground chamber had somehow preserved itself through 2 decades of Montana winters. Garrett checked his pistol automatically before grabbing the lantern. "You stay close," he told Mako. The shepherd immediately moved beside him. Together, they descended slowly into the darkness. The steel stairs groaned beneath Garrett's boots. The air grew colder with every step. By the time they reached the bottom, Garrett could see his breath thick in the lantern glow. The underground chamber stretched wider than he expected. An old ice cellar. Massive cedar beams supported the ceiling overhead, while stone walls disappeared into shadow on both sides. Thick frost coated everything. The room looked frozen in time. Wooden shelves lined the far wall. Old crates sat stacked beneath tarps stiff with ice. A rusted military radio rested atop one work table beside yellowed maps curled with age. Garrett moved carefully through the chamber, while Mako stayed close against his leg. The dog's growling had stopped now. That disturbed Garrett almost more than the barking. Mako wasn't warning him anymore. The shepherd was searching. The lantern light swept across faded writing painted along one wall. Blackwater Storage Level B. Beneath it, another sentence appeared hand-painted in smaller letters. If the ice holds, the truth holds. Garrett felt chills unrelated to the cold. Nathaniel Mercer had known exactly what he was doing down here. This place wasn't random. It was built to preserve something. Garrett approached the nearest shelf slowly. Journals, dozens of them. Leather-bound notebooks stacked carefully in rows, each labeled by year. He opened one carefully. Inside were handwritten notes, maps, dates, water levels, shipment numbers, and names. So many names. Garrett frowned. What the hell were you tracking? Mako suddenly moved deeper into the chamber. The shepherd stopped near the far wall beside several steel storage crates half covered by frozen canvas. Garrett approached carefully. The first crate carried faded military markings. Property of U.S. Geological Survey. The second crate bore no markings at all, only a heavy chain wrapped around the lid. Garrett pulled the canvas aside. Beneath it sat several sealed metal tubes and thick waterproof folders. One had partially fallen open long ago. Photographs spilled across the frozen floor. Garrett crouched slowly and picked one up. Dead cattle beside a riverbank. Another photo. Discolored water flowing from drainage pipes into mountain streams. Another. Children standing outside a rural school holding bottled water. His stomach tightened. The next image hit harder. A handwritten report stamped confidential beside the logo of Blackwater Mining Company. Toxic Disposal Authorization. Garrett stared at it silently. Mako stood beside him now, ears forward, listening again. Garrett opened another folder. Maps, reservoir locations, dump sites marked in red pencil, dates spanning nearly 15 years. The entire valley around Elk Hollow suddenly looked different in his mind. Not untouched wilderness, a crime scene buried beneath snow and mountains. Then Garrett found the final photograph. Nathaniel Mercer. Older, standing beside Blackwater Lake in winter, and behind him, barely visible near the tree line, 3 men watching him. Garrett turned the photo over slowly, one sentence written across the back in faded black ink. They know I found it. The lantern flickered suddenly. Mako growled. Garrett's head snapped toward the steel staircase. A sound echoed faintly from above. Footsteps. Inside the shed. Someone had entered the Mercer ice house. Garrett Boone extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the underground chamber. Only the faint glow of moonlight filtered down the steel staircase from above, pale and weak against the frozen walls. Mako's growl deepened beside him. The shepherd's ears locked upward toward the sound. Footsteps. Slow, careful, crossing the floor above the hidden cellar. Garrett's pulse steadied into pure military focus. No panic, no hesitation, just instinct. He crouched beside the steel stairs, pistol raised toward the opening overhead, while icy air drifted around them. Somewhere above, old floorboards creaked softly beneath shifting weight. One person, maybe two, trying not to make noise. Garrett leaned close to Mako's ear. Quiet. The shepherd immediately fell silent. Another sound drifted downward, metal scraping wood. The hatch. Someone had discovered the loose floorboards. Garrett tightened his grip on the pistol. The cellar suddenly felt smaller now. The cold pressed against his lungs while shadows stretched endlessly through the underground chamber. Above them came a muffled voice. "You see anything?" Another voice answered. "Just keep looking." Garrett recognized neither voice. Not Voss himself. More hired men, searching. A flashlight beam suddenly swept across the crack above the staircase. Thin white light pierced the darkness. Mako's muscles tensed beneath Garrett's hand. Then came the sound Garrett dreaded most. The warped floorboards shifting. Whoever stood above had started pulling them apart. Garrett moved silently deeper into the cellar. The hidden chamber extended farther than he first realized. Frost-covered stone walls curved toward old storage alcoves packed with crates and shelves. Some areas disappeared entirely into darkness beyond the lantern's reach. This place had been built for long-term preservation. Not just ice. Secrets. Mako followed close beside him while the sounds above grew louder. Wood cracking. Heavy boots shifting. Then, clang. Steel. One of the men above had struck the hatch. "They found it," Garrett whispered. The shepherd growled softly again. Garrett moved toward the far side of the chamber, where several old support beams created deeper shadows. From there, he could still see the staircase while remaining hidden beneath darkness. Then the hatch wheel groaned overhead, not fully opening, testing. The men above didn't yet understand how heavy the steel door truly was. Garrett's eyes moved quickly around the chamber. There had to be another exit. Nathaniel Mercer wouldn't have built a hidden underground room with only one entrance. Not a military engineer. Not a man hiding evidence. Garrett swept his flashlight carefully across the far wall. Nothing. Old shelving. Crates. Frozen stone. Then Mako moved suddenly. The shepherd padded toward a narrow alcove near the back corner of the cellar and sniffed along the wall. Garrett followed. There. Faint scrape marks beneath frost. A second door almost completely hidden inside the stone. Garrett's pulse tightened. Nathaniel Mercer had built an escape route. Of course he had. Before Garrett could inspect it further, the sound above changed violently. Metal screamed against metal. The hatch was opening. Cold air rushed downward through widening cracks overhead, while flashlight beams stabbed into the darkness below. "Jesus Christ!" One of the men sounded nervous now. "There's a whole damn bunker down there." Garrett remained perfectly still in the shadows. Mako pressed silently against his leg. A flashlight beam swept down the staircase. Then another. One of the men started descending cautiously. Heavy boots clanged softly against steel steps. Garrett watched the figure approach through darkness. Black winter jacket, gloves, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other. Not professionals. Real professionals moved quieter than this. The man reached the bottom step and froze. The flashlight beam drifted across the frozen chamber. Shelves, crates, maps, the hidden evidence Nathaniel Mercer had buried beneath the ice. "Boss was right," the man whispered upward. "There's stuff everywhere." Garrett stayed motionless, waiting. The second man started down the stairs too. "You see him?" "No." The first beam swept dangerously close now. Garrett could hear his own breathing. Hear Mako's breathing, slow, controlled. The second man finally reached the bottom. Then the first one noticed the open journals. "Grab those." The moment both men lowered their weapons to collect the evidence, Garrett moved, fast, silent. He crossed the darkness in 3 strides and slammed the first man hard into the stone wall before the attacker even understood what happened. The flashlight flew sideways. Mako hit the second man full force a split second later. The cellar exploded into chaos. A gunshot thundered through the underground chamber. Stone dust rained from the ceiling. Garrett drove one elbow into the first attacker's jaw while wrenching the pistol from his hand. The second man screamed beneath Mako's attack. The shepherd held him pinned against the frozen floor, teeth bared inches from the man's throat. "Call him off!" Garrett shoved the first attacker hard against the wall again. "Who sent you?" The man spit blood onto the floor. "You're dead already!" Garrett slammed him back harder. "Who sent you?" The answer came from the staircase above. Warren Voss's voice, calm, cold. "You really should have taken the money, Mr. Boone." Garrett looked upward sharply. Voss stood at the top of the stairs wearing the same charcoal coat from the diner. Snow drifted behind him through the open hatch while 2 more armed men waited above. The developer looked down into the frozen chamber quietly. Then his eyes moved across the shelves and evidence surrounding Garrett. For the first time since meeting him, Warren Voss no longer smiled. "You have no idea what you're standing inside," he said softly. Garrett kept the pistol raised. "Looks like proof." Voss descended slowly into the cellar. His expensive shoes crunched frost beneath each careful step. "This valley survives because of my family," he said. "The mines kept these towns alive for generations." Garrett glanced toward the photographs scattered across the floor. "By poisoning half the water supply?" Voss's expression hardened. "You think people wanted the truth back then? You think they wanted every ranch and business in this valley destroyed overnight?" He spread one hand toward the frozen chamber. "Nathaniel Mercer was going to ruin everything. He tried exposing you. He tried destroying this town." Garrett stared at him silently. Outside above them, wind howled across Blackwater Lake, while snow swirled through the open hatch overhead. Voss stepped lower into the chamber. "You know what Mercer never understood?" he asked quietly. "People protect what feeds them, even when it's ugly." Mako growled viciously beside the pinned attacker. Voss looked toward the dog. "Remarkable animal." Garrett's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "Stay where you are." For the first time, real anger flickered across Voss's face. "You think you can stop this now?" he snapped. "Nathaniel Mercer thought the same thing 20 years ago." Silence crashed through the cellar. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You killed him." Voss didn't answer directly, which was answer enough. The frozen chamber suddenly felt colder than before. Garrett looked toward the journals again, toward the maps, toward the photographs Mercer died protecting. An old veteran had hidden all of it beneath the ice because nobody else would stand guard over the truth. Until now. Voss slowly removed leather gloves from his hands. "You're not the first broken soldier to wander into something bigger than himself," he said quietly. "But you can still walk away." Garrett almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, he looked toward Mako. The shepherd's amber eyes never left Voss. Still guarding. Still ready. Then Garrett looked back toward the hidden evidence preserved beneath the ice for 20 years. And finally, he understood why Nathaniel Mercer built this place underground. Cold preserved things. Ice preserved things. Truth lasted longer beneath winter than it did in the hands of powerful men. Garrett raised the pistol steadily. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I'm walking away anymore." Silence settled across the frozen underground chamber. The only sounds came from the wind above the hatch and the slow dripping of thawing frost somewhere deep inside the cellar walls. Warren Voss stared at Garrett Boone for a long moment. Then he sighed softly, almost disappointed. "You really are like Mercer," he said. Garrett kept the pistol steady. Maybe that's your problem. The two armed men behind Voss shifted uneasily near the staircase. Mako remained crouched low beside Garrett, growling softly, teeth still inches from the throat of the man pinned against the frozen floor. Nobody moved. The hidden cellar seemed suspended outside time itself. Then Voss slowly nodded. Fine. His voice cooled completely now. You want the truth? Nathaniel Mercer wasn't some hero. He gestured toward the shelves of evidence. He was obsessed, paranoid. He spent years digging into things that should have stayed buried. Garrett's eyes drifted briefly toward the journals. And now you're trying to bury them again. Voss's jaw tightened slightly. You think exposing this helps anybody? The mines shut down, this valley dies, thousands lose work, ranches collapse, families leave. Garrett stared at him. You keep saying the same thing. Because it's true. No, Garrett replied quietly. Because it's how men like you sleep at night. The words hit harder than shouting would have. Voss's face hardened. You have one chance to leave this cellar alive. Garrett glanced toward the steel crates again, toward the photographs of poisoned streams and sick children, toward the maps Nathaniel Mercer died protecting. Then he looked back at Voss. You already killed one veteran to protect this mess. His voice remained calm. You don't get another. Something dangerous flickered behind Voss's eyes then. Not panic, not fear. Cold calculation. Garrett recognized it immediately. Men like Warren Voss never believed consequences truly applied to them. Voss slowly stepped backward toward the stairs. You're making a mistake. So did you. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Voss gave a small nod toward his men. Let's go. The tension in the chamber shifted instantly. Garrett's finger tightened against the trigger, expecting violence. But surprisingly, the men obeyed. Even the one pinned beneath Mako slowly rose and backed toward the staircase with blood running from shallow bite wounds along his sleeve. Before climbing out, Voss looked down at Garrett one final time. When this place burns, he said quietly, make sure that dog gets out first. Then they disappeared above ground. Seconds later, an engine roared somewhere outside the shed. Tires spun against snow. Then silence returned. Garrett remained frozen several moments longer, listening carefully. Nothing. Only storm wind and the deep groaning sounds of Blackwater Lake beneath winter ice. Mako slowly relaxed beside him. Garrett finally lowered the pistol. His hands shook slightly now that the adrenaline began fading. The hidden cellar suddenly felt impossibly cold, not just physically, emotionally, like standing inside another man's final secret. Garrett looked around slowly. Nathaniel Mercer had known this day might come. Every detail proved it. The hidden hatch, the military-grade steel, the preserved evidence, the escape route concealed in the rear wall. Mercer had prepared for war beneath this icehouse, a war nobody believed he was fighting. Garrett walked slowly toward the shelves again while Mako followed close beside him. The journals stretched across decades. Names, dates, water tests, shipment records, entire histories buried underground while the world above moved on pretending nothing happened. Then Garrett noticed something else resting beneath the maps. An oilcloth pouch, carefully folded, protected from moisture. His pulse slowed. The pouch felt heavier than paper alone. Inside, he found a single sealed envelope, yellowed with age. One sentence written across the front in careful black ink. To the soldier who finds this place. Garrett stared at the words silently. Mako sat beside him now, watching quietly. The shepherd's injured shoulder bled faintly through the bandage again, but the dog remained focused entirely on Garrett, always watching him, always pulling him back from the edge. Garrett broke the seal carefully. The paper inside crackled softly in the freezing air. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. Military handwriting. February 11th, 2004. If you are reading this, then the cellar still stands, which means winter protected the truth longer than men could. My name is Nathaniel Mercer. I built this place because I ran out of people I could trust. The town would not listen. The county would not listen. The companies bought everyone else. So I buried the evidence beneath the ice. Cold preserves things, truth included. Garrett swallowed hard and continued reading. I do not know who you are, soldier, but I know what kind of man finds a place like this. You are probably tired. You are probably carrying ghosts. And you have probably already learned that this country forgets some of its soldiers once the fighting ends. I know because it forgot me too. Garrett stopped breathing for a moment. The frozen cellar blurred slightly around him. He read on, Vietnam took pieces of me I never got back. The war ended, but the noise never really stopped afterward. I came home and tried to disappear into work, into winter, into silence. But eventually I learned something. Some men survive war because they are meant to stand watch a little longer. That line hit Garrett like a physical blow. His chest tightened painfully. Not panic this time. Something deeper. Mako slowly rested his head against Garrett's knee. The old shepherd seemed to understand somehow that this moment mattered. Garrett lowered one hand onto the dog's neck while continuing. The men poisoning this valley believe cold weather buries everything. They are wrong. Ice remembers. Water remembers. And men like us remember too. If they come for this place after I'm gone, protect the truth if you can. If you cannot, then at least make sure somebody finally sees it before the snow covers everything again. And trust your dog. Dogs hear danger before men admit it exists. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. For several long seconds, the underground chamber disappeared around him entirely. Afghanistan returned instead. Night missions, dust storms, helicopter blades beating through darkness, Chris Mercer laughing beside a fire barrel 2 days before the explosion that killed him. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. His wife, Emily, standing in their kitchen years earlier begging him not to take another overseas contract. You're home, but you're never really here anymore. He remembered leaving anyway, always leaving. By the time he returned for good, cancer had already hollowed her body thin. 3 months later, she was gone. His son stopped answering calls after the funeral. Garrett never blamed him. Some soldiers came home carrying war inside them, and sometimes families got crushed beneath the weight. The cellar felt very quiet now. Mako pressed closer against him. Garrett looked down at the final lines of Nathaniel Mercer's letter. If this place found you, soldier, then perhaps winter chose correctly. Stand watch a little longer. Nathaniel Mercer. Garrett lowered the letter slowly. The storm above seemed farther away now. Even the cold felt different somehow. Not empty anymore. Purposeful. The old Vietnam veteran had known exactly who would eventually understand this place. Not a lawyer, not a politician. Another damaged soldier. Another man trying to survive after war ended. Mako whined softly and rested his chin against Garrett's leg. Garrett finally looked down at him and smiled for the first time in years. A real smile. Small, tired, but real. You knew before I did, he whispered. The shepherd's tail tapped lightly once against the frozen floor. Above them, wind swept across Blackwater Lake while snow buried the world deeper beneath white silence. And deep under the Mercer ice house, inside a hidden cellar preserved by cold and memory and grief, Garrett Boone finally understood something that war had stolen from him long ago. He still mattered. The realization settled quietly inside him, while snow battered the world above. For several minutes, Garrett remained seated beside the frozen wall, with Nathaniel Mercer's letter trembling slightly in his hands. Mako rested against his leg, breathing slow and steady, despite the stitched wound in his shoulder. The underground chamber no longer felt haunted now. It felt entrusted. Nathaniel Mercer had built this place for one purpose. Not revenge, not greed, preservation. Truth hidden beneath winter until someone strong enough to carry it forward finally arrived. Garrett folded the letter carefully and slid it inside his coat pocket close against his chest. Then he stood. The soldier inside him had fully awakened now. Not the man from Afghanistan. Not the broken veteran sleeping in truck stops. Something steadier. Something clearer. He moved through the cellar methodically, gathering the most important evidence first. Journals, photographs, maps, water reports, the old military radio. Everything Nathaniel Mercer died protecting. Garrett wrapped the materials in waterproof canvas and secured them inside an old transport crate near the hidden rear exit. Mako followed every movement closely, watching, guarding. Outside, the storm worsened. Wind screamed across Blackwater Lake hard enough to shake frost loose from the cellar ceiling. Somewhere overhead, the old shed groaned beneath snow and ice. Garrett paused near the staircase and listened. Nothing. For now. But Warren Voss would come back. Men like him never walked away from threats, especially not threats buried under 20 years of corruption. Garrett climbed the steel stairs cautiously, with pistol drawn. The main shed stood silent above him, beneath flickering lantern light. The hatch remained open in the floor, like a wound in the building itself. Snow hissed softly against the walls. No movement. Still, Garrett secured the doors again and covered the exposed hatch with loose boards and tarps. Mako stood near the windows watching the darkness outside. The shepherd's ears never stopped moving. Garrett approached the old workbench slowly. A faded photograph sat there now among the tools and sawdust. He didn't remember leaving it there. Nathaniel Mercer in younger years beside Blackwater Lake, and standing beside him, a black German shepherd, military posture, service harness, the old veteran's war dog. Garrett stared at the image silently. 2 soldiers, 2 dogs, separated by decades, connected by the same frozen place. Mako whined softly beside him. Garrett scratched behind the shepherd's ears. Guess he had one too. The dog rested his head briefly against Garrett's side, then suddenly stiffened, growling. Garrett looked up immediately. Headlights, far across the frozen lake. Several sets this time, moving, fast. His pulse slowed instantly into combat calm. They're coming. The lights spread wider across the ice as snowmobiles and trucks advanced through the storm toward the Mercer property. Too many for intimidation now. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was cleanup. Garrett extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the shed. Outside, engines roared closer through blowing snow while Mako barked sharply near the door. Garrett moved fast. Years of SEAL training returned naturally now, every motion clean and practiced despite the years away from combat. He grabbed the transport crate from the cellar and hauled it toward the hidden rear passage Nathaniel Mercer had built decades earlier. The concealed stone door groaned open into a narrow tunnel leading beneath the hillside behind the shed. An escape route. Mercer truly had prepared for war. Garrett shoved the crate into the tunnel first. Mako, stay close. The shepherd obeyed instantly. Then came the first gunshot. The front windows exploded inward in a spray of frozen glass. Wood splintered overhead. Garrett dropped behind the workbench while bullets tore through the old cedar walls. The attackers weren't aiming to scare him anymore. They intended to erase everything. Fire suddenly bloomed outside one window. Molotov cocktails. Gasoline. The smell hit immediately. "They're burning it," Garrett whispered. The old ice house that survived generations of Montana winters suddenly filled with orange light as flames crawled across the outer walls. Smoke rolled along the ceiling. Mako barked furiously. Voices shouted outside. "Get inside! Find the cellar!" Garrett fired once through the doorway. A man screamed outside. Then silence. The snowstorm swallowed the sound instantly. Garrett's breathing remained calm now. Strangely calm. For the first time in years, his mind felt clear. Not trapped in old memories. Not drowning in panic. Focused. Present. The way he used to feel protecting his team overseas. Only now he was protecting truth instead of orders. Another bottle smashed against the rear wall. Fire spread faster. The dry cedar beams caught immediately. Smoke thickened through the shed while flames climbed toward the roof. Mako suddenly growled toward the hidden tunnel. Garrett looked sharply. Movement. Someone had discovered the rear escape route. A masked attacker emerged through blowing snow near the hillside carrying a rifle. The man spotted Garrett instantly. Everything happened fast after that. Garrett shoved the evidence crate deeper into the tunnel, while Mako lunged forward with terrifying speed despite the injured shoulder. The shepherd hit the attacker before the rifle could fully raise. Both disappeared into snow and darkness outside the burning shed. "Mako!" Garrett sprinted after them into brutal freezing wind. Flames roared behind him now, casting violent orange light across Blackwater Lake while snow swirled through smoke and sparks. The attacker struggled beneath Mako's weight near the frozen shoreline. Then Garrett saw the knife. The man raised it toward the dog. Garrett tackled him hard into the snow an instant before the blade struck. The rifle slid across the ice. Mako snarled viciously while Garrett pinned the attacker beneath him. The man ripped off his ski mask during the struggle. Young, maybe 25. Terrified. "Please!" Garrett froze. Not a hardened killer. Just another desperate man hired by Voss. Mako stood above them, growling. The young attacker's eyes widened in fear. "They said nobody would get hurt," he stammered. "They said you were dangerous." The burning shed cracked loudly behind them. Flames burst through the roof. Garrett looked back. The Mercer ice house stood fully engulfed now. Nathaniel Mercer's final watch post collapsing into fire and smoke beneath the storm. And suddenly, Garrett understood something terrible. The evidence. Still inside the tunnel entrance. If the fire spread farther, the entire hillside could collapse. Garrett released the young attacker immediately. "Get out of here!" The man scrambled backward in shock, before fleeing into the storm without another word. Garrett turned toward the burning building. Smoke rolled violently across the lake while pieces of flaming cedar crashed inward. Mako barked beside him. The dog knew exactly what Garrett intended before he moved. "We're not losing it," Garrett said quietly. Then together, they ran back toward the flames. Two soldiers charging once more into danger neither of them could walk away from. The Mercer ice house burned like a giant lantern beside Blackwater Lake. Flames climbed through the roof in violent orange waves, while thick black smoke rolled upward into the snowstorm. Wind drove sparks across the frozen shoreline, scattering embers over the ice like fireflies swallowed by winter. Garrett Boone pulled his coat over his mouth and pushed forward through the smoke. "Mako!" The shepherd stayed tight beside him despite the stitched wound tearing open again along his shoulder. Blood darkened the snow beneath his paws, but the dog never slowed. The hidden tunnel entrance remained half-covered by collapsing timber near the rear hillside. Garrett dropped to his knees beside it and started dragging away burning debris with bare, gloved hands. Heat scorched his face instantly. Behind him, the old shed groaned deep inside its frame. The building was dying. "Mako, back!" But the shepherd barked sharply and lunged toward the tunnel opening instead. Garrett looked up just in time to see why. One of Voss's remaining men had circled back through the storm. The attacker emerged from smoke carrying a gasoline can toward the rear hillside, toward the tunnel, toward the evidence. The man froze when he spotted Garrett. Then his eyes shifted toward the transport crate partly visible inside the hidden passage. For 1 second, neither moved. Then the attacker sprinted forward. Garrett met him halfway in the snow. They collided hard enough to knock both men onto the frozen ground beside the burning shed. The gasoline can flew sideways, spilling fuel across snow already melting from the fire's heat. The attacker swung wildly. Garrett blocked instinctively and drove one hard elbow into the man's ribs. Military reflexes returned with terrifying clarity now. Years vanished. Pain vanished. Only movement remained. The attacker reached for a handgun buried beneath his coat. Mako hit him before he could draw it. The shepherd slammed into the man's chest and pinned him against the snow with a savage growl. Garrett scrambled up, breathing hard. "Enough!" The dog froze instantly at the command, though his teeth remained inches from the son's throat. The attacker stared up at Garrett in pure panic now. The flames behind them roared louder. Then came a new sound. Sirens. Faint at first, growing closer through the storm. Headlights appeared beyond the trees near the lake road. Multiple vehicles. Garrett turned sharply. Deputy Lena Torres's patrol truck burst through the snow first, tires sliding hard near the shoreline. 2 volunteer fire trucks followed behind it, while townspeople spilled from pickup trucks carrying shovels and extinguishers. Somebody in town had seen the fire. Deputy Torres stepped out with shotgun drawn. "Everybody stay where you are!" The attacker beneath Mako immediately raised both hands. Garrett slowly backed away. Snow swirled violently around them, while the fire crews rushed toward the collapsing shed. Torres recognized Garrett instantly. "Boone?" He tried burning the place. The deputy looked from Garrett to the attacker pinned beneath Mako, then toward the flames consuming the Mercer ice house. "What the hell is going on out here?" Garrett glanced toward the hidden tunnel, toward the crate still buried inside. Torres followed his gaze. Her expression changed instantly. "You found something." Before Garrett could answer, another vehicle approached through the storm. Black SUV, Warren Voss. The developer stepped out calmly despite the chaos surrounding the burning shed. He stopped when he saw the deputies and firefighters. For the first time since Garrett met him, Voss looked genuinely unsettled. Deputy Torres immediately noticed. "You know this man?" Voss adjusted his coat calmly. "Of course. Mr. Boone recently purchased my family's former property." Garrett almost laughed at the lie. Torres narrowed her eyes. "Your employee just tried setting that property on fire." Voss glanced toward the attacker still trapped beneath Mako. The younger man lowered his eyes instantly. Cowardice. Fear. Garrett recognized both. Voss sighed quietly. "I think everyone here is exhausted and confused." "No," Garrett said firmly. "We're finally not confused anymore." The wind shifted suddenly, driving smoke across the shoreline. Behind them, part of the Mercer ice house roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks. Several firefighters shouted warnings. The old building would not survive much longer. Garrett looked toward Torres. "There's evidence beneath the shed." The deputy frowned. "What kind of evidence?" Garrett stared directly at Warren Voss. "Murder." Silence spread instantly through the storm. Even the firefighters paused. Voss's expression hardened cold as ice. "You should think carefully before making accusations." Garrett ignored him. "There's a hidden cellar under the floor. Nathaniel Mercer kept records down there. Water reports, disposal maps, Mining records tied to Blackwater operations. Torres looked stunned. The poisoned reservoir rumors. They were true. One of the older firefighters stepped forward slowly. My brother got sick from that water. Another man spoke quietly behind him. So did my cattle. The mood around the lake shifted instantly. Not fear anymore. Recognition. Old suspicions returning to life. Voss realized it too. His calm mask began cracking for the first time. You people have no idea what you're talking about. Garrett stepped closer. Nathaniel Mercer did. The developer's eyes sharpened dangerously. Then Mako barked suddenly toward the burning shed. Garrett turned. Flames had reached the main floor above the cellar hatch. The entire structure shuddered violently. If the hidden chamber collapsed now, decades of evidence could vanish forever. Garrett moved instantly toward the tunnel entrance. Torres grabbed his arm. That building's coming down. The evidence is still inside. So let it burn. No. Garrett looked directly at her. Too many people already buried this. Something in his voice stopped her cold. Not anger, conviction. Torres slowly released his arm. I'll cover you 5 minutes, she said quietly. Garrett nodded once. Then he disappeared into the smoke-filled tunnel with Mako beside him. Inside, heat rolled through the underground passage now despite the frozen stone walls. Smoke drifted down from cracks overhead, while distant beams groaned under the weight of fire. Garrett reached the transport crate and dragged it toward the exit. Heavy, too heavy. The ceiling cracked loudly somewhere above. Dust and ash rained downward. Mako barked sharply. Almost there! Garrett forced the crate forward inch by inch through the narrow tunnel while smoke thickened around them. Then another sound emerged through the chaos. A low, deep groan. Structural collapse. The old shed was giving way. Garrett shoved the crate toward daylight just as part of the tunnel ceiling crashed behind them in a wave of stone and timber. Mako leapt clear first. Garrett stumbled out seconds later into snow and freezing air, while the rear section of the Mercer ice house collapsed entirely behind them. Flames exploded upward into the storm. The hidden cellar vanished beneath burning debris. Everyone near the shoreline stepped backward in stunned silence. Nathaniel Mercer's final watch post was gone. Garrett dropped exhausted beside the crate while snow hissed against his smoke-covered coat. Mako limped beside him and finally lowered himself into the snow, breathing heavily. Garrett rested one hand against the shepherd's neck. You did good, partner. Deputy Torres approached slowly and opened the crate. The journals rested inside beneath waterproof canvas. Photographs, maps, reports, proof. Her face paled as she flipped through the documents. Then she looked toward Warren Voss. The developer already understood. It was over. Farther back among the crowd, several townspeople stared at him with expressions Garrett recognized immediately. Betrayal. The kind that changes communities forever. Federal investigators arrived before dawn. The storm finally weakened near sunrise while emergency lights reflected across the frozen lake in silent red and blue flashes. Warren Voss was escorted away in handcuffs without another word. As his SUV disappeared down the snowy road, Garrett stood beside the smoking ruins of the Mercer ice house with Mako at his side. Nothing remained now except charred beams, drifting smoke, and the faint outline of the place where the old shed once stood. But something else survived. Truth. Deputy Torres approached quietly, holding a small metal box covered in soot. We found this near the back foundation, she said. Garrett opened it carefully. Inside lay several military medals wrapped in old cloth, Vietnam-era dog tags, and one faded black-and-white photograph. Nathaniel Mercer stood beside a German shepherd near Blackwater Lake sometime long ago. Both looked younger. Both looked tired. Both looked like they understood each other completely. Garrett stared at the photograph a long time. Then he noticed writing on the back. Some soldiers come home. Some never really leave the watch. Garrett swallowed hard. Mako rested his head gently against his knee. Snow drifted softly across the frozen lake while dawn slowly touched the mountains surrounding Elk Hollow. And standing there beside the ruins of the Mercer Ice House, Garrett Boone finally understood something Nathaniel Mercer had learned decades earlier. War did not always end when men came home. Sometimes it simply changed what they were protecting. Winter returned quietly to Blackwater Lake 3 months later. Snow covered the mountains surrounding Elk Hollow in clean white silence while smoke curled gently from chimneys across town. The bitter scandals surrounding Warren Voss and Blackwater mining still dominated state headlines, but life in the valley had begun slowly reshaping itself around the truth. Federal investigators uncovered decades of illegal dumping records tied to reservoir contamination across northern Montana. Former mining executives faced charges. State cleanup crews arrived before spring thaw. Families who had spent years suspecting something was wrong with their water finally had answers. But the biggest change in Elk Hollow was harder to explain. People had started looking at Garrett Boone differently. Not like a drifter anymore. Not like the broken veteran sleeping in a truck beside the lake. Now, when he walked into Mabel's diner, ranchers nodded respectfully. Mechanics offered coffee. Old men asked about the dog. And every Saturday morning, somebody new drove out to Blackwater Lake to help rebuild the Mercer Ice House. The new structure stood 30 yards from the burned ruins. Smaller than the original. Simpler, too. But strong. Fresh cedar beams framed the roof while thick stone foundations anchored the building against the shoreline winds. The hidden cellar beneath remained sealed and reinforced under Deputy Torres's supervision, preserved now as official evidence storage for the state investigation. Garrett insisted on rebuilding the shed himself, board by board, beam by beam. The work steadied him in ways therapy and medication never had. Each morning before sunrise, he and Mako walked the frozen shoreline together, while darkness still clung to the lake. Garrett carried a thermos of black coffee. Mako limped slightly now from the shoulder wound, but remained stubbornly loyal to every routine. The dog still checked the perimeter of the property every morning, still watched the tree line, still slept near the cellar hatch every night. Some habits never disappeared. One bitter January morning, Garrett stood atop the rebuilt roof fastening cedar shingles while snow drifted softly through pale sunlight. Below him, Walter Grinnell leaned against his truck drinking coffee. "Mercer would have liked this," the old man called upward. Garrett hammered another nail into place. "Maybe," Walter chuckled. "That old man spent half his life believing nobody would ever finish what he started." Garrett climbed carefully down from the roof and brushed snow from his gloves. "You knew him well?" Walter nodded slowly, closer toward the end. His eyes drifted toward the frozen lake. "Nathaniel wasn't crazy like folks claimed. Just tired." He paused. "War leaves some men carrying storms inside them." Garrett looked down at Mako beside the porch steps. The shepherd lay quietly watching snow fall across the lake. "He understood that too," Garrett said softly. Walter noticed the old photograph hanging inside the rebuilt shed window. Nathaniel Mercer beside his military dog, right beside Garrett's own faded team photo from Afghanistan. 2 generations of soldiers, 2 dogs. The old rancher smiled faintly. "Looks like the place finally found the right guardian." Guardian. Garrett thought about the word long after Walter left. For years after leaving the Navy, he had drifted from one temporary job to another. Overseas security work, construction, warehouse shifts, anything that kept him moving long enough not to think too hard. But eventually the drifting turned into isolation, then debt, then drinking, then silence. After Emily died, the silence became permanent. His son Daniel stopped answering calls 6 years earlier. Garrett never chased him, partly from guilt, partly from shame. A father should have been stronger than this. But now something had changed. Not overnight, not magically. Healing never worked that way. But Blackwater Lake gave him structure again. Purpose. A reason to wake up before dawn. A reason to stay. That afternoon, Deputy Lena Torres arrived carrying a cardboard box under one arm. "More records from the investigation," she said while stepping inside the rebuilt shed. Garrett cleared space on the workbench. "You finding everything you needed?" "More than we expected." She glanced around the new structure approvingly. "Place looks good." The smell of fresh cedar mixed warmly with wood smoke from the iron stove near the wall. Sunlight reflected off the frozen lake through the windows, while Mako slept beside the cellar hatch. For the first time in decades, the Mercer property no longer felt haunted. It felt alive again. Torres removed several folders from the box. "There's something else." Garrett looked up. The deputy handed him a sealed envelope. No return address. Only one word written carefully across the front. "Dad." Garrett stared at it silently. His hands suddenly felt heavier than the envelope itself. Torres spoke gently. "Daniel contacted the sheriff's office after the news broke. Said he saw your name online connected to the investigation." Garrett swallowed hard. "He okay?" "He wants to visit." The room went very quiet after that. Mako slowly lifted his head and looked toward Garrett as if sensing the shift immediately. Garrett sat down heavily on the bench. For years he imagined this moment differently. Angrier, more painful. But now, holding the letter in the rebuilt ice house beside Blackwater Lake, he mostly felt afraid. Not combat fear. Something deeper. The fear of disappointing someone one last time. Torres rested one hand lightly against the doorframe. "You know," she said softly, "not everybody gets a second chance." Then she left him alone with the envelope. Garrett waited nearly an hour more before opening it. The handwriting inside looked older than he remembered. "Dad, I didn't know if you'd even read this. I saw the story online about the lake and the fire and the dog. Mom used to say you were only truly calm around water or animals. I guess she was right. I'm coming up Saturday if that's okay. No pressure if you don't want company. I just thought maybe it's time. Daniel." Garrett read the letter twice, then once more. Mako crossed the room slowly and rested his head against Garrett's knee exactly the same way he had inside Nathaniel Mercer's hidden cellar weeks earlier, grounding him, steadying him. "You think I can do this?" Garrett whispered. Mako's tail thumped softly, once against the floorboards. Saturday morning arrived beneath clear skies and brutal cold. The lake ice groaned softly beneath sunrise while smoke drifted from the rebuilt Mercer ice house chimney. Garrett stood outside near the shoreline holding 2 coffee mugs when the old blue Subaru finally appeared down the lake road. His heartbeat felt louder than artillery. The vehicle stopped slowly beside the shed. A man stepped out, tall, dark-haired, mid-20s now, older than the last memory Garrett carried. Daniel hesitated beside the car door. So did Garrett. For one long moment, neither knew how to cross 6 years of silence. Then Mako made the decision for both of them. The old shepherd trotted forward through the snow and stopped directly in front of Daniel, watching him carefully. Daniel stared down at the dog, then slowly smiled. "I remember him." Garrett swallowed hard. "Yeah." Mako leaned gently against Daniel's leg. Acceptance. Permission. Something loosened inside Garrett's chest after that. Not fixed, not healed completely, but loosened. Daniel walked toward the lake slowly, while snow drifted across the mountains surrounding Blackwater in silent waves of white. "You rebuilt it," he said quietly. Garrett nodded. "Couldn't let it disappear." Together they stood looking across the frozen water, while dawn spread gold light over the mountains. Behind them, the rebuilt Mercer ice house stood quiet and steady beside the lake. Mako settled peacefully near the cellar hatch inside the warm cedar building, older now, slower now, but finally resting without fear. Garrett looked toward the framed photographs hanging inside. Nathaniel Mercer and his war dog, Garrett and his SEAL team. 2 generations connected by winter, loss, loyalty, and the long, difficult road home. Snow drifted softly across Blackwater Lake. And at last, Garrett Boone understood the final truth Nathaniel Mercer left behind beneath the ice. Some soldiers never stop standing watch, but sometimes, if they're lucky, they finally stop standing watch alone. If this story meant something to you, type "Stand Watch" down in the comments. And if you've ever had to fight for your home, your family, or your peace of mind, we'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you believe old-fashioned loyalty, quiet courage, and the truth still matter in this country. There are more stories waiting down the next snowy road.